Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 298, Francis II, the Shadow King of France. The sudden death of Henry II of France ushered in an era of uncertainty throughout the kingdom. Catherine de' Medici had little time to grieve the loss of her husband. The Guise family was ascendant and would play no little role in all the religious turmoil to come, arch-Catholic as they were. Francis II was only 15 years old in 1559. He could hardly be expected to rule on his own. Instead, there would be a royal regency made up of a variety of individuals, but most critically the Guise family and Catherine herself, who remained desperate to stay within the sphere of influence. The royal party moved into the Louvre Palace on the 11th of July, 1559. And, with this simple act, the Guises accomplished a coup d'etat without spilling a drop of blood. You see, because they installed themselves in the best apartments, the new regime lost no time in falling upon the initial spoils of their family's stunning victory. The Duke of Guise, in fact, took Diane de Poitiers' room, and his brother, the Cardinal, those of Montmorency, the former leaders of the state under Henry II. Catherine had covered her walls and floors with black silk, with no daylight to penetrate. The two flickering candles did little but add to the gloom. Wearing black, with only a tiny white ermine collar to highlight the effect, Catherine was described by observers as remaining virtually motionless in her anguish. She was absolutely exhausted by the strain of the past 10 days, the time between Henry II's jousting match, injury, and his ultimate death. Many confessed that they were moved to tears at the sight of Catherine's utter depression. Often the new queen would stand behind her mother-in-law to help with these difficult interviews, and by new queen, of course, I'm talking about Mary, Queen of Scots, the wife of the young Francis. She wore a lily-white wedding dress, and Mary would often reply on Catherine's behalf, thanking the visitors for their condolences, and, whenever possible, managing to insert a flattering reference to her uncles and their ability to help the new king steer France safely forward. And they had, by the way, a lot to do. Henry's last round of wars with the Habsburgs had left France deeply in debt. Francis and those around him knew that if France had any hope of clawing its way out of the quagmire, strict austerity measures would have to be the order of the day. Making matters worse, Henry's death had removed the last link of loyalty between the soldiers who had fought his wars and the kingdom itself. These men were angry. As they streamed over the Alps to their home, it would not only be the indignation of suffering the Treaty of Château-Cambrésis, but also the fact that they had not been paid, which caused their collective blood pressure to rise. These very men would soon become the foot soldiers in France's looming religious wars. Yet more serious than the economic, political, or even religious problems confronting Francis were the factional disputes behind the scenes between the Guise and Montmorency factions and families. Montmorency remained the Constable of France, though with the Guise family controlling Francis, that title meant very, very little. One other potential source of strife was Antoine de Bourbon, the first prince of the blood. He, perhaps more than anyone else, could claim the right to run the Regency Council. Everyone urged Antoine to make his way to Paris as soon as possible to take his rightful place. But instead, true to his personality, he dithered, moving slowly from the west, where he had been in residency when Henry died. When he got to Paris, Bourbon found only insults and a cold shoulder from the Guise family to greet him. Bourbon had consistently shown himself to be an ally of the Protestant cause, so there were natural reasons for the Guise family to dislike him beyond being merely a potential rival to their power grab. They need not have been worried. Bourbon's main interest in life was to restore the tiny kingdom of Navarre, which had been halved in size by the Spaniards in the early 1500s. Dithering and hopelessly self-indulgent, He became miraculously animated by the slightest hint of retrieving these lost territories, which were his by virtue of his marriage to Henry's cousin, Jean d'Albert. Otherwise, he was an uninspiring man and a terribly uninspiring leader, surrounded by bad advisors. He was a man incapable of making any decisions, especially good ones. When he arrived in Saint-Germain, it had been placed under heavy guard by the Guises in case he came in force. There, he was simply outfaced, outthought, and outmaneuvered by Catherine and the Guise faction. Their public disdain for the first prince of the blood and his ultimately spineless acceptance of their treatment emasculated him in front of his followers and effectively removed him as an independent source of political legitimacy. The other person left firmly out in the cold as a result of Henry's death was his old favorite and lover, Diane de Poitiers. She knew her days in the sun were over, and she took the change in her position with grace. Diane returned all the jewels and other crown properties that the former king had gifted her. She then retired to the country, where she spent the rest of her life doing good works and staying out of trouble, so that her family might inherit her vast wealth, which they did when she passed in 1566. Catherine never had time to relish in finally defeating her great rival. Francis needed protecting, both from the overbearing Guise family and from his young and beautiful wife, Mary Stuart, whom he worshipped. Francis had no interest in running the country. His reign is short, but let me be clear about that. He spent his days hunting or at other pursuits, though his fragile frame was hardly up to the challenge. Francis was constantly sick, and many feared him infertile. Francis was aware of his frailties, and he hated his physical shortcomings. He dressed in the most sumptuous robes, which only made him look smaller and even less physically able. Except when he was hunting, he was horribly timid. During his entire reign, which again wasn't long to be fair, the royal council only met once with him leading it, once. Otherwise, the Guise family and Catherine ran the show, issuing orders and decrees in his name. Francois of Guise ran the military, while the Cardinal of Lorraine, also a member of the Guise family, in fact it's Francis's brother, took charge of all domestic matters and foreign affairs. Hence, why I have dubbed Francis a shadow king. Between August 11th and August 13th, 1559, Henry II was buried. After Henry was laid to rest, Francis made sure that his mother was well provided for, but then turned much of his attention to his wife, Mary. Catherine, meanwhile, treated the new queen with deference and respect. She handed over the crown jewels to Mary, and among the fabulous gems she added pieces that belonged to her personally. She was studiously correct in her dealings with her daughter-in-law, and never treated her less than cordially. It is said that Mary felt unwisely snobbish about Catherine's less exalted origins than her own, and her notorious comment that Catherine was just a Florentine shopkeeper's daughter has been attributed to her. If Catherine heard these remarks, she chose to ignore them, but she would not forget them. Besides, the Queen Mother seemed more regal and remote ever in her severe black gowns and widow's dignity. Much has been made of the rivalry between Mary and Catherine, or at least of jealousy on Catherine's part. Fantastical stories about her desire to get rid of Mary. There's even one suggestion that the Queen Mother was planning to poison her own son to remove the young woman from her powerful position, are just pieces of romantic fiction. While Catherine might have been keen to minimize her daughter-in-law's hold over the young king, she always appeared kind and good-natured to Mary, at least while her son was alive. At Blois, during the first winter since Henry's death, the two queens could often be found in each other's company, sometimes listening to their daily sermons together either in their shared dining room or in the chapel. To be fair to the politically astute Catherine, she deliberately stayed out of the spotlight during Francis's short reign. She knew that the issues plaguing France after Henry's death, notably its bankruptcy and the religious divisions, were going to either tear the country apart or require incredibly stringent measures to control. In either case, whoever was in charge would be left holding the bag. And even if Catherine was in charge, at least in part, she wanted to make sure that if people were going to blame someone, that they were going to blame the Guise family. Catherine could only watch as the Cardinal of Lorraine struggled with France's economy. At Francis II's ascension, the public debt was around 40 million livres, mainly a legacy of the wars in Italy and northern France. Royal revenue, derived from taxes, amounted to less than 10,000 livres per annum. To make matters worse, half of the debt was due to be paid immediately. The Guises, who had begun their new reign with lavish gifts to their various client vassals and repayments of their own debts, none of which went unnoticed or enhanced their popularity, now had to find a solution. Rather than raise taxes, the cardinal decided to cut expenditure drastically, which he did in an incredibly arbitrary fashion. Royal interest due on loans was simply reneged upon. Pensions were frozen. Magistrates and other officials had their salaries abruptly stopped. French soldiers, many of them still on their way back from Italy, were promptly and unceremoniously demobilized and left unpaid. They had every reason to feel betrayed by the politicians who had simply handed back their hard-won territories. These disillusioned men, now receptive to ideas of rebellion, would form the ranks of the armies that were to fight each other in the civil wars to come. All the while, the religious problem as well continued to grow like an untreated cancer. The Guise response to everything was to crack down harder on the Protestants, with the result that by 1559, things were already reaching a boiling point. No one knew Catherine's beliefs for sure, but most at least believed her to be more moderate. She had been close to Marguerite, the Duchess of Savoy, who had known Protestant sympathies. All the while, the Guise family continued to pursue a policy of ruthless persecution. Catherine believed all along that this would merely ignite an unavoidable blaze. Even the cardinal, who was the enforcer of these new draconian laws against heretics, would declare later on, quote, "No man hates extremes more than I do," end quote. Though Catherine was unable to intervene on behalf of several prominent Protestants, she did maintain contact with certain Calvinists through her moderate or Protestant friends. If Catherine was unable to help them, desperate Calvinists sought leadership and protection elsewhere. Unfortunately, Antoine de Bourbon was proving to be absolutely nothing short than pathetic. His brother, Louis de Condé, offered a more inspiring opportunity and began to attract attention as a natural rallying point. Condé was as frustrated by his brother as the other Calvinists had become, and driven by personal ambition, family pride, and some religious conviction, and the poverty arising from being a second son, he found that this new religious cause could offer him an excellent platform. Condé's main problem as the potential, we'll call him, opposition leader, was that he lacked the legitimacy that his elder brother possessed as the first prince of the blood. And that effectively gave Antoine de Bourbon his claim to head whatever was effectively a regency council. Now, meanwhile, France's involvement militarily against the English in Scotland continued to provide another reason for the Guises' growing unpopularity. When Francis became King of France, he was already King of Scotland by virtue of his marriage to Mary Stuart, and he claimed with his wife the throne of England. To the fury, as we know, of Queen Elizabeth I, the royal couple's coat of arms incorporated those of Scotland, France, and England, brazenly professing their assertion. In September 1559, Mary of Guise, the regent of Scotland, found herself once again facing rebellions, fueled by religious dissension and political grievance. Elizabeth in England did all she could to support the rebels in the north. Mary was only saved from catastrophe by the arrival of French troops in what became known as the War of the Insignia, the name stemming from Mary and Francis's incorporation of the English arms into their own. Catherine, whose ambitions did not coincide with the Guises regarding Scotland, believed strongly that France could not afford to continue these foreign adventures and needed their troops at home. She considered the whole affair in Scotland nothing less than a potential disaster. Francis's health, meanwhile, gave continued cause for concern. By autumn of 1559, his deeply frustrating dizzying spells had become constant. When he felt himself lose consciousness, he would frantically move his limbs in order not to faint. His skin was blotchy and his face more swollen than ever, now was covered in boils and pimples. Although he had grown considerably in height since becoming king, this only seemed to have made him weaker. In an attempt, however, to defy this physical weakness, hunting became his constant obsession. At last, he fell sick with an abscess in his ear. The agonizing pain almost drove him mad. Catherine called in physicians who advised her to remove the king to the Loire Valley, where he might recover in the peaceful countryside. She decided to take him to Blois for the winter and early spring. Queen Mary, who was no stranger to ill health and fainting spells either, she suffered from often minor but debilitating ailments. Unsurprisingly, the Guise family felt uneasy about the future of the Valois-Guise dynasty, since the prospects for a healthy baby, particularly in view of the widely held belief that Francis was unable to have children, did not look promising. The royal couple's health issues could not be kept secret for long, if at all. The wealthier you were in the 16th century, the less privacy you enjoyed. While all this was going on, Princess Elizabeth, another of Catherine's children, set off for Spain, having been betrothed for some time to Philip II. Now, this was a critical match, because the marriage kept relations between Spain and France peaceful, going into a period when both kingdoms desperately needed external peace. Lord knows things were about to get domestically very messy. And speaking of messy, in February 1560, the first rumors of a plot against the Guise family and their regime started to filter back to Paris. And these rumors focused on Louis de Condé. The 29-year-old Condé was a short, energetic man, and he had courage and spirit. Unable to involve himself directly in the plot, the prince entrusted a minor nobleman, the Sieur de Ranelagh, and I'm not a French expert, by the way, so I'm doing my best with these names, with the preparation of the details. La Rayonnais, once a former client actually of the Guises, with a grudge against them and a dubious past, had to flee to Geneva, where he then converted to Calvinism. Now, John Calvin himself wanted nothing to do with the man, but he did receive support from Théodore de Bèze, Calvin's most senior lieutenant. A meeting took place on the 1st of February 1560 at Nantes, near the port of Hughes, and the plotters there agreed their aims, which were, essentially, to capture the Guises and then beg the king to try these ministers for corruption. After that, it was hoped to be possible to redress the other wrongs in the kingdom by establishing now a Bourbon regency with Condé at the head. La Rayonnais sent out 500 agents in secret to recruit mercenaries without being given the name of the chief. Foreign soldiers were enlisted, and the plotter also approached Queen Elizabeth of England for help. Some sources report that the queen supplied a little money, others that she gave only moral support, an altogether cheaper commodity, of course. The conspirators meeting at Hughes was the origin for the name Huguenot, by the way, a term subsequently used for French Protestants. So if you've ever wondered where it comes from this conspiracy. They initially agreed that the coup would take place on the 10th of March, although this was later changed to the 16th. Unfortunately, the essential element of surprise vanished as rumors of the plot inevitably spread. In the days of informants and agents all around, it proved impossible to keep an undertaking of this size secret, even with the greatest discretion. In this case, there was a profusion of leaks from just about everywhere. English Catholics who heard about it warned the Cardinal of Lorraine. A German prince confirmed the story to the Bishop of Arras. And as if to seal the fate of their own plot, Le Roi recklessly boasted about his involvement and imminent downfall of his enemies. He told a Parisian lawyer and Huguenot sympathizer with whom he was staying about his plans, down to, quite frankly, the last detail. The lawyer, a Huguenot but nonetheless terrified that he himself would be charged with treason, reported everything that he heard now to the cardinal. As the rumors received confirmation from different quarters, the Guises and Catherine became alarmed. Convinced that Queen Elizabeth of England stood behind the plot in retaliation over French involvement in Scotland, and that the use of force of the rebels might be much larger than reported, Francois de Guise set about planning how to thwart the uprising and defeat the enemy. Catherine wrote to the Duchess of Guise, quote, "We have been warned from all directions that men are marching toward Blois. The king, my son, has been much annoyed by this and ordered that these men should return to their homes." End quote. She continued that it would be her policy to act as though there was nothing amiss, but Francois of Guise, he had other plans. Because Blois was deemed an easy target for attack on the 21st of February 1560, the Duke ordered the immediate removal of the king and the court to the nearby fortress of Amboise. This was a huge medieval stronghold that would prove difficult to take, particularly since the defenders had received such detailed forewarnings about the plot. Catherine argued with the Guises that far from being an English plot, it seemed more likely that the enemies came from within. With the support of a few others at court, Catherine became convinced that now was the time to soften measures against Protestants, that if they could do that, they might be able to pull back from the precipice. These efforts resulted in the so-called Edict of Amboise, which gave people amnesty for all prior religious crimes. It was not, however, a declaration of freedom of worship. And none of this did anything in the end to end the intense feeling of hostility that surrounded the castle. But for the moment, a kind of strange calm reigned over the region. No one quite knew what was going to happen. Court business continued, but there were urgent whispered inquiries for news between the courtiers. Around the same time, Le Roi was busy deploying his men around the town of Amboise, still confident of the success of his plan. The royal family, the chief nobles, awaited the first strike, though they hoped that their troops would find the rebels first. In the mounting atmosphere of tension with false alarms, the mood of suspicion increased. Word arrived from a foreign informant that the leader of a great uprising was a prince. Wondering who might be involved of the most senior nobles at court, Catherine made Condé, who had only just arrived and whose Protestant sympathies were no secret, chief of the king's bodyguard. This move required the prince to remain at the castle by the king's side at all time. It was very smart. While this post could, in theory, be taken as a great honor, it was also a subtle form of arrest, since he no longer enjoyed the freedom to move about. Condé, however, affected an air of complete and total calm. On March the 6th, a small group of about 15 men were captured in the woods surrounding Amboise. They seemed relieved to have been caught and appeared confused about the plot and their intended role. A captain of the guard came and confessed to the Queen Mother that he had intended to take part in the plot, and described a plan to seal off the king's apartment and there to separate him from the Guises. Where small groups of disorganized men were found, they appeared to be simple people who merely wanted to speak directly to the king about the new religion. At last, on the 15th and 16th of March, the main captains of the rebels were arrested. La Renaud himself was discovered in the woods on the 19th of March and killed by an arquebus shot. Larger forces from further afield turned back when they heard of the failure of the enterprise, and those who did arrive were easily overcome. Locals and troops sent out by Guise not only repulsed the feeble effort of the remaining rebels, but hunted them down in the countryside, either killing them on the spot or bringing them back for summary justice. The triumphant Duke wanted punishment of the rebels to send a message that would resound throughout the kingdom, deterring anyone else. The lower liberals were either sewed into sacks and dumped into the river Loire to drown or hanged from a high balcony in a clear view above the town. The battlements provided convenient gibbets, and for the next 10 days, dangling clusters of decomposing bodies decorated the castle. Belaying her later bloodthirsty reputation, Catherine did her best to intercede for the life of at least one of the officers, but the Guises ignored her. When the executions were over, Catherine did her best to conduct her own post-mortem over the rebellion. What had caused men to risk their lives and, by consequence, her son's throne in this way? The answer she received was clear. There were two types of Huguenots, those who generally believed in and followed the new faith, and those who were simply unwilling to tolerate the Guise regime. The former, Catherine realized she could do nothing for, but the latter she might be able to accommodate. In the end, the rebellion of Amboise and the violent reprisals that followed only stiffened the resolve of those opposed to the regime. And like many harsh crackdowns throughout history, all the Guise family managed to do was make a fringe rebellion more popular. In a devastating turn for France, many new converts would now be noblemen who could arm and organize the masses into a serious fighting force. The stage was now set for a major confrontation. This was the situation, then, that compelled Catherine to take the initiative and call a meeting of the full royal council. As I mentioned before, this was the only time said council was called during Francis's reign, and Catherine got what she wanted: peace with England in Scotland. Engulfed in domestic turmoil, France could no longer afford to keep sending men and money to Scotland. Mary and Francis refused to give up styling themselves the King and Queen of England, but at least France would stop propping up what looked increasingly like a failing Catholic state to the north of England. This was yet another example of Catherine's political acumen. But even this successful council was not without its ominous warning bells. Several Bourbon family members did not attend the council meeting. This was a message. They believed the Guise regime was illegal, and they would take no part in it. Civil war seemed imminent. And then disaster struck. On November the 9th, Francis fainted. No one knew why. A week later, it happened again. This time, doctors investigated and discovered a fistula in his left ear, causing the king immense pain. Doctors could do nothing. It was, in all likelihood, a death sentence. Catherine now had to confront the reality that her son might not survive, and that she would need to get through yet another transfer for power. With Charles Maximilian, the heir, only 10 years old, he would legally be declared a minor, and a regency would be set in place to rule until he reached the age of 15. The Estates General would be most likely to vote for a Bourbon regency, in which Catherine would have much less power than she had enjoyed in harness with the Guises. She knew that she had to act immediately to prevent a vote from taking place. Catherine now showed just how good of a political manipulator she had become. As the king recovered slightly, thanks to a lancing of the abscesses, which released a huge amount of pus, the Queen Mother decided on her move. She summoned Condé's brother, Antoine de Bourbon, to her presence. There, in front of the Guises, Catherine bitterly accused Bourbon of plotting to incite rebellion and reproached him for his treacherous behavior. Fearful of ending up condemned to die like his brother had before him, Bourbon loudly protested his innocence, but offered, as a sign of good faith, to give up his right of regency to the Queen Mother. It worked. She made him sign a document then and there to the effect, and in return she promised that he would be made lieutenant general should Charles ascend the throne. The Guises, who now feared their own safety for prosecuting Condé without due process of law, were paid off by Catherine when she made the dying king confirm the fiction that it was he and not the Guises who had ordered the arrest and trial of Condé. Catherine then asked the brothers and Bourbon to embrace each other as a sign of reconciliation. This was an utterly meaningless gesture, but it capped her triumph nonetheless. By brilliantly playing her two rivals off against each other, Catherine had emerged supreme. And then, on December the 5th, 1560, after a reign of only 16 months, the young Francis died. With decisive action, Catherine took over the running of the royal household. The day after Francis's death, she demanded the crown jewels back from his widow, Mary Stuart, and then left her, bereft, sitting in a black-draped room. None could deny the torment that Catherine suffered at the loss of her son, but she now required her immediate concentration to secure her own position and that of her 10-year-old son, the new king. After ordering that access to the palace be barred, the Queen called a privy council meeting at which she declared Charles Maximilian King of France, henceforth to be known as Charles IX. She opened the meeting with these words: "Since it has pleased God to deprive me of my elder son, I do not mean to abandon myself to despair, but to submit to the divine will and to assist and serve the king, my second son, in the feeble measure of my experience. I have decided, therefore, to keep him beside me and to govern the state as a devoted mother must do. Since I have assumed this duty, I wish all correspondence be addressed in the first place to me. I shall open it in your presence, and in particular in that of the King of Navarre, who will accompany the first place in my council as the dearest relative of the king. Such is my will. If any of you wish to speak, let him do so." End quote. Antoine, King of Navarre, gave his assent, and the others formally added theirs, as of course Catherine knew they would. Earlier, on the day after Francis's death, the Duke of Guise and his men, who had spent the night in vigil over the king's body, came to express their loyalty to the Queen Mother and her son. Also present were Mary Stuart, the younger royal children, the Cardinal of Lorraine, Antoine Bourbon, and a few other favored courtiers. It was an important opportunity for both the Guises and Bourbon to load the blame for any past mistakes on the dead king, and thereby clear the way for the future. The Queen Mother listened to their speeches, in which they admitted their errors, but said that they had acted solely on the express orders of King Francis, the King Francis who had only called one meeting in his entire reign and who had always been hunting. But hey, fiction it was, it still worked. Whenever the Duke paused, Catherine nodded slowly and replied in a quiet, mournful voice, quote, it is true, what you have done was by the command of my son," end quote. Bourbon then proceeded to do the exact same thing. Now pressed for time, as the Estates General, which did not know Bourbon had handed his rights to the regency to Catherine, were gathering, Catherine called a private council on the 21st of December. Having neutralized both the Guises and Bourbon, she had herself therein proclaimed governor of the kingdom, effectively enjoying all the powers of the monarch. Much as the Guises had done after Henry's death, she presented now the Estates General with a fait accompli. In a country where the monarch had changed 3 times now, in 17 months, Catherine, the regal matriarch clad in mourning, had become, I suppose, a comforting figure, and she had come to represent continuity. She was 41 years old. She had arrived at the pinnacle of power within the kingdom. The dangers that France was facing had not diminished, but at last she could now try to deal with them in her own way. Next time, we shift back to England to see how Elizabeth deals with the fallout from the death of Francis II and the ongoing affairs in England, as well as continuing domestic troubles. In the interim, if you'd like any more content, check out the links in the show notes. I've got a link to Western Civ 2.0. We're deep into the Punic Wars now, one of my favorite topics. And you can get a free 7-day trial by clicking the link below and listen in any way you choose.